As a child, Mr. Fidler lived in the countryside and said that entertainment was that of which he could provide himself.
Well, I lived out in the country, dirt road, so I pretty much had to entertain myself. We weren't close to anybody else, and once I got old enough that I could get on a bicycle and visit friends that I made in elementary school and things like that, I started getting around.
After that, Mr. Fidler looked for a job.
Took a part-time job when I was 13 at a dairy bar and miniature golf course.
According to Mr. Fidler, he led a pretty normal life. As we learned from the interview, Mr. Fidler's motive to enter the military was that he felt an obligation to do something. He said,
I had already been out of school for several years and had a job, and I had friends that were in the Army Reserve unit in Reading. It was Company B, 365th Engineers, and they told me some of their projects, things they worked on in different communities on weekends, and some of their summer 2-week active duty training sessions. And they said there was an opening in the mess section, and I sort of like to play with food, so I thought it just sounded like an opportunity.
Mr. Fidler decided to take advantage of this opportunity. Hence, this began his time with the Army Reserves. When Mr. Fidler enlisted, he was almost 21 years old.
Well, I probably entered as one of the, maybe an older one. I was almost 21 already at that time.
Mr. Fidler explained that he was nervous to experience boot camp training and life on base. He said that his friends told him about what would generally happen, but it was definitely different when actually experiencing it.
Even though they had sort of told me things that would happen and things to do and not to do, and what to look for while you were there, it still was different than actually going and experiencing.
In the interview, Mr. Fidler talked about what training was like.
Well, when you first went in, everyone has to go through what they call basic training, so that's strictly physical, shooting a rifle, a lot of running, a lot of calisthenics, some classroom work, compass reading. I mean, the basic things a soldier would need to know and do. And after that, once you graduate out of that, then you go into your individual training. And of course, mine was the 94 B-20 was to be a cook. So, and that was a different situation then.
After being asked, Mr. Fidler said that at first it was difficult to adapt to the new environment. However, after having been yelled at and told what to do, you'll learn to adapt very quickly. Mr. Fidler also touched upon the subject of how it felt knowing that if they needed backup, his troop could be sent to war at any time.
Well, it's something you know is possible. We trained. We were an engineering company, so had they needed support in that field during the Vietnam War era, we knew we had the possibility of being called to back up the regular Army or actually be put in a working situation.
When interviewing Mr. Fidler, we learned that he was a cook for the Army Reserves. However, people couldn't just sign up to make breakfast. It was a lot of hard work, just like any other military occupation. He said,
that also was an 8 to 9 week course, and you learned everything from basics, almost like boiling water, to how to prepare different cuts of meat and potatoes, and you learned everything about cooking that you would need to know to feed the troops.
However, it wasn't all work and no play.
Once you got into the cook school portion of it, you were on duty 24 hours and off duty. It was 24 on, 24 off. That's how cooks work.
Mr. Fidler explained that he and his colleagues enjoyed their time off together.
We knew where the skeet shooting range was and the golf club, and we just, anybody could go to those places and participate. So,
Mr. Fidler achieved the ranking of an E6 Staff Sergeant in the Culinary Division. This wasn't just given to him. He worked very hard to earn his rankings. When first entering the military, everybody is known as a private. According to Mr. Fidler, it takes years to build up your ranking, as any of the soldiers would know. When he graduated from his training, he was promoted to PFC, which is Private First Class, and spent his other years with the reserves working as a cook. Eventually, when he did not re-enlist, he had earned the position of an E6 Staff Sergeant.
Before Mr. Fidler left the service, he worked many hours in the kitchen. He explained to us that
Well, the Army serves 3 hot meals a day. At least it did when I was there. So you served what would be breakfast was a full line of hot pancakes, and then you did eggs to order on the grill. As the guys came through, they would order what they wanted, and you made them right in front of them. And so it was, of course, being in South Carolina, you had grits on the steam table every day, and there were a variety of cold cereals, but there was always fruit. Typical breakfast items, and lunch and supper was a meat and a starch item, generally a potato, some pasta, not probably mixed, and always a vegetable and some kind of a dessert or fruit available.
He explained that everyone received the same amount of food no matter what the ranking of each soldier. However, the only difference was that the non-commissioned officers had a separate dining area. There weren't really any items of food that the soldiers were not allowed to eat. Mr. Fidler described what it was like to prepare so many meals for so many soldiers. He said that even though there were so many soldiers to feed every single day, he was not the only cook working in the kitchen. Every cook worked hard to prepare the meals for themselves and the soldiers.
after answering the question, was there ever a time in which it was hard to make enough food for all the soldiers to eat? Mr. Fidler explained that when the soldiers walked in to eat, there was a roster for them to sign, making it easier for the cooks to know how much food to prepare for each meal that day. They never ran short on food because of this process.
The soldiers were really appreciative of these cooks, including Mr. Fidler, in preparing so many meals for them every single day. There was not a big variety of places where the soldiers could eat, so everyone was grateful for what they had.
Each meal that the cooks were to make had to have a certain serving size and a nutrition level. The mess sergeants had already known ahead of time the nutrition level of each meal prepared. He said, so they know the nutritional value of it, the calories, what kind of vitamins and minerals you're going to get out of it. So everything is already figured out.
In order to become a cook in the Vietnam War, they were to attend classes every single day for a few weeks before they had to cook for the soldiers.
Mr. Fidler told us that the cooks in the Army were a pretty tight-knit group. This experience was very memorable for him. As a matter of fact, some of the soldiers that went off to different branches of the Army were past graduates of the school he went to.
Mr. Fidler's worst hardship that he went through during his time as a cook was after he had gotten married and had children. It was very difficult for him, as well as his family, for him to leave home.
Probably the worst part was once I had been married and I was we were having our family and the children, and certain places we went for summer camp for 2 weeks would take me away for 2 weeks. I wasn't able to get home, so it made it a little hard at home, but.
However, as far as the reserves aspect, there were not really any hardships.
After the war was over, Mr. Fidler had finished his time with the Army Reserves. He decided to return and stay home with his family, who was glad to have him around. Regarding the end of the war, he explains to us that he did not have a problem in being treated poorly. As a matter of fact, his employer kept his previous job position open for Mr. Fidler. Coming home after 18 weeks of training, Mr. Fidler was greeted by his family, who was excited to have him back.
Mr. Fidler then describes to us how glad he was to experience being a cook in the Army Reserves during the Vietnam War. He tells us that it's different when you're there and someone runs your life. Overall, Mr. Fidler was very glad that he was able to experience something like this and learned a lot from his time with the Army Reserves.
We would like to thank Mr. Fidler for his service time and for sharing his story with us.